Anthology by Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera. Critique of Political Liberalism. Liberalism is, on one hand, the regime without faith, the regime that hands over everything, even the essentials of a country's destiny, to free discussion. For liberalism, nothing is absolutely true or false. The truth is, in each case, what the greater number of votes say. Thus, it does not matter to liberalism if a people agrees upon suicide, provided that the proposed suicide is carried out in accordance with electoral practice. And since for the functioning of electoral practice, the existence of factions must be encouraged and strife between them must be stimulated, the liberal system is the system of permanent disunion, permanent want of popular faith in any profound community of destiny. Liberalism brings division and unrest in the realm of ideas. Socialism opens the even more violent chasm of economic strife in our midst. Under either regime, what becomes of the unity of destiny, without which no people is, properly speaking, a people at all? The state believes in nothing. The state believes neither in liberty nor in the sovereignty of the people, for it suspends both whenever required. The state does not even believe itself to be the depository or the executor of a paramount purpose. The liberal state believes in nothing, not even in itself. It stands by with folded arms before experiments of every description, including even those aimed at the destruction of the state itself. It is satisfied if everything develops in accordance with certain regulation forms of procedure. Could anything more foolish be imagined? A state in whose eyes nothing is true elevates to the position of an absolute and unchangeable truth this attitude of doubt, and this alone. It makes a dogma of anti-dogmatism. Hence, the liberals are prepared to let themselves be killed for maintaining that no idea is worth men's while to kill each other for. Liberalism is the mockery of the unfortunate. It proclaims marvelous rights, freedom of thought, freedom to propagate ideas, freedom of work. But these rights are mere luxuries for the favored ones of fortune. The poor in a liberal regime may not be bludgeoned into working, but they are starved out. The isolated workman, possessed of every sort of right on paper, has to choose between dying of starvation and accepting the terms the capitalist offers him, however hard they may be. Under the liberal system, the cruel irony could be seen of men and women working themselves to skeletons 12 hours a day for a miserable wage, and yet being assured by the law that they were free men and women. When, in March 1762, a man of ill omen called Jean-Jacques Rousseau published The Social Contract, political truth ceased to be a permanent entity. Previously, in ages that were more profound, states, which were the executors of historic missions, had inscribes upon their brows, and even upon the stars, the words justice and truth. Jean-Jacques Rousseau came to tell us that justice and truth were not permanent categories of reason, but that they were, at any given moment, decisions of the will. The Geneva philosopher was a sickly man, delicate and refined. He is a philosopher who, as Spengler tells us, happens to all romantics, And this man was, by now, a direct precursor to Romanticism, was fatigued by the feel of living in too healthy and too virile and too robust a society. He was crushed by the weight of such a fully adult society and felt, as it were, constrained to leave it, to return to nature, to free himself from discipline, harmony, and rule. This yearning for nature is the keynote of all his writings, the return to freedom. The most famous of his books, whose influence was to last throughout the 19th century and only began to lose its grip in practically our own times, does not, as you have so often read, begin absolutely, but it almost does, with a sentence which is a sigh. It reads, "Man is born free and finds himself everywhere it fetters." This philosopher, as you are all aware, was called Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The book was called The Social Contract. The social contract seeks to deny the justification of those authorities received traditionally by reason of either a supposedly divine appointment or one based upon the tradition. He seeks to deny the justification of these powers and to begin building afresh on the basis of his own nostalgia for freedom. He says, man is free. Man is free by nature and cannot in any way divest himself of being free. There cannot be any system but that which he accepts of his own free will. His freedom he can never renounce, because it would be the equivalent to renouncing his quality of being human. Moreover, if he were to renounce freedom, he would be entering into an agreement void for want of value received in exchange. He cannot but be free, and unrenounceably free. Consequently, no form of state can possibly arise in opposition to the free wills of those that make up society. The origin of political societies must have been contract. This contract, the aggregate of these wills, engenders a higher will, a will which is not the sum total of the others, but self-subsistent. It is a different ego, superior and indifferent to the personalities that produced it by their presence. Very well, this sovereign will, this will now detached from the other wills, is the only one that may legislate. This is the only one that may impose itself on men, without men's having any claim against it. Because if they turned against it, they would be turning against themselves. This sovereign will can neither err nor seek the evil of its subjects. Jean-Jacques Rousseau supposed that the agglomeration of all of us who live as a nation possesses a higher soul, one belonging to a hierarchy different from that of each of our own souls, and that this higher ego is endowed with an infallible will, able at any instant to define justice and injustice, good and evil. And as this collective will, this sovereign will, is expressed by means of suffrage alone, a majority conjecture that triumphs over the minority one in the matter of divining what the higher will may be. The eventual result was that suffrage, that farce of little paper slips going into a glass ballot box, possessed the power of telling us at any moment if God existed or not, if the truth was true or untrue, and if our country ought to continue, or if, on the other hand, it was better that it should commit suicide. The revolution finds the principles of Rousseau already developed and adopts them in the Constitution of 1789, in that of 91, in that of 93, in that of the third year, in that of the eighth year. The principle of national sovereignty is formulated almost in the same words used by Rousseau. The principle of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. No corporation and no individual can exercise authority which does not emanate expressly therefrom. Do not imagine that the mere declaration of this gives rise to universal suffrage at the same time. It is only in one of the French revolutionary constitutions, that of 1793, that this principle got applied and this suffrage established. In the rest, it did not. In the rest, suffrage is restricted, and in that of the 8th year, it even disappears. But the principle is always formulated in the words, all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. Nevertheless, there is something in the revolutionary constitutions that was not in the social contract. And this is the declaration of the rights of man. I said just now that Rousseau did not allow the individual to reserve to himself anything as against that sovereign will, that sovereign ego constituted by the national will. Rousseau did not allow this. The revolutionary constitutions did. But it was Rousseau who was right. The time was to come when the power of the assemblies became so great that in reality the power of the single man disappeared. And it was illusory for any kind of rights that the individual had reserved to himself to seek to prevail against that power. As the liberal state was the faithful servant of this doctrine, it gradually constituted itself as no longer the resolute executor of the country's destinies, but as a spectator of electoral struggles. For the liberal state, the only important thing was that there should be, seated at the voting tables, a certain number of gentlemen, that the election should begin at 8 o'clock and end at 4, and that the ballot boxes should not be broken, whereas being broken is the noblest destiny of any ballot box. Thereafter, to observe with calm respect what should issue forth from the ballot boxes, as if it had itself no interest therein. In other words, the liberal rulers did not even believe in their own mission. They did not believe that they themselves were there to fulfill a duty worthy of respect, but that anyone who thought the contrary and set about assailing the state by fair means or foul had just as good a right to say so and to do so as the guardians of the state itself had to defend it. Hence arose the democratic system, which is, in the first place, the most ruinous possible system for the squandering of energy. A man endowed with the gifts for the high function of governing, which is perhaps the noblest of all human functions, was obliged to devote 80, 90, or 95% of his energies to making good the routine objections of opposition, to the making of election propaganda, to sleeping whole nights on parliamentary benches, to flattering electors, to enduring their impertinencies, because it was from the hands of the electors that he was going to get power, to tolerating humiliation and indignities at the hands of those who, by very reason of the quasi-divine function of governing, were required to obey him. And then, after all this, if he had a few hours left towards daybreak, or a few moments stolen from an uneasy repose, it was in this minute period to spare that the man endowed with gifts for governing was able to give serious thought to the substantive functions of government. Later, there came the loss of the spiritual unity of peoples. For as the system worked by achievement of majorities, every object that the system set itself to gain had to obtain a majority of votes. And it had to obtain them by stealing them, if necessary, from the other parties. And for this reason, it had to have no hesitation in defaming them, in heaping upon them the vilest obloquies, in deliberately falsifying the truth and not letting slip a single means of lying and vilification. And thus, fraternity being one of the postulates displayed before our eyes on the title page of the liberal state. There has never been a collective condition of life in which wronged men, at enmity one with another, have ever felt themselves less fraternal than in the turbulent and unpleasant life of the liberal state. Finally, the liberal state came to involve us in economic slavery, for the workers were told, with tragic sarcasm, "You are free to work as you wish. No one can compel you to accept these conditions or those. Very well then, as we are the rich, we offer you the conditions we think fit. You, as free citizens, are not obliged to accept them if you do not want to. But you, as poor citizens, if you do not accept the conditions that we impose upon you, will die of starvation, surrounded by the greatest degree of liberal dignity." Liberalism, and it may be described thus because the raising of a barrier against tyranny was just what the revolutionary constitutions aimed at. Liberalism has its great period, the one during which it establishes all men as equals before the law, a victory from which there can now be no retrocession. But this victory, once achieved, and its great period over, liberalism begins to find itself with nothing to do and spends its time destroying itself. Naturally enough, what Rousseau termed the sovereign will becomes reduced to the will of the majority. According to Rousseau, it was the majority, theoretically, through its faculty of divining and expressing the sovereign will, but in practice through its triumph over the dissident minority, which should prevail over all. The achievement of this majority implied that the parties had to enter into conflict so as to win more votes than their rivals, that they had to make propaganda against one another, after having broken up themselves. In other words, it is precisely under the thesis of supposedly indivisible national sovereignty that opinions are most divided. For as each group seeks that its own will shall be identified with the presumptive sovereign will, the groups grow more and more obliged to define themselves, to adopt distinctive attitudes, to fight, to destroy one another, and to try to win the electoral battles. Thus, it comes about that in the decomposition of the liberal system, and of course, this transit, which has been summed up in a few minutes, is a process lasting many years. In this decomposition of the liberal system, the parties become so broken up that when the regime has reached its last gasp in some parts of Europe, as it did in the Germany of the days just before Hitler, there were no less than 32 parties. In Spain, I should not dare to state what they all are, because I myself do not know. Indeed, I do not even know the ones represented in Parliament, for apart from all the groups officially represented, and those fused into parliamentary blocks, and apart from the members who, either alone or with one or two bosom friends, parade under a group denomination, there is in our parliament, as Don Mariano Matesans is aware, one extraordinarily odd thing. 2 minorities, each composed of 10 gentlemen, and calling themselves independent minorities. But mark you, not because as being minorities they are independent of the rest, but because each one of their component individuals regards himself as being independent of all the others. So that those who belong to these minorities, to which neither Don Mariano Matesans nor I belong, since we are independent altogether, those who belong to these minorities owe their grouping together and their connecting link to just their characteristic note of not being in agreement. In other words, the only thing they agree about is that they don't agree about anything. And naturally, apart from this pulverization of parties, or rather, on emerging from this pulverization of parties through the conditional union of one or two parties, we then observe the phenomenon that the majority, half parliament, plus one member, or half parliament plus two, feels invested with the full sovereign power of the nation to exploit or crush the rest, not merely of the members, but of the Spanish people. It feels itself to be the holder of a limitless power of self-justification. In other words, it feels itself endowed with authority to carry through whatever it thinks fit, without paying any further attention to any kind of personal judgment, juridical or human, so far as the rest of mankind is concerned. Jean-Jacques Rousseau had foreseen something of this kind when he said, "Very good, but as the sovereign will is indivisible and moreover incapable of error, if by a chance a man even finds himself in conflict with the sovereign will, it is the man who is in error. And at such a time, when the sovereign will constrains him to submit to it, it is doing nothing but compelling him to be free." Observe the sophistry, and just consider whether, for instance, when we members of the Republican Parliament, undeniably the representatives of the national sovereignty, increase your taxes or invent some other uncomfortable law to annoy you with, it has ever occurred to you to think that in this act of raising your taxes or annoying you a little more, we have been carrying out the benevolent task of making you a little more free, whether you liked it or not. This concludes the chapter titled "The Critique of Political Liberalism" from Anthology by José Antonio Primo de Rivera. Read by the son of Arias.